You might not recognize his name, but Shitaro Ishinomori has quite the legacy. If you're watching this video, chances are high that you're familiar with something that traces back to him. That one manga adaptation of The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, you might have read in Nintendo Power or seen on the shelf at your local bookstore. He did that. Maybe you're familiar with one of the many adaptations of Cyborg 009. That's a manga series he created. Perhaps you've watched Power Rangers, or if you're really cool, you watched Power Rangers in its original form, the Super Sentai series. Once again, give credit where credit is due. But in 1971, between 1964's Cyborg 009 and 1975's original iteration of Super Sentai, Ishinomori gave the world, arguably, his most significant creation. The ever-popular Tokusatsu series started life as The Skullman, a dark one-shot manga originally published in the Weekly Shonen magazine in January of 1970. A whole lot would change during the transition from the pages of a magazine to the television screen, though if nothing else, the design of the title character would be the basis of a series that would, along with Return of Ultraman, kickstart a new wave in the popularity of Tokusatsu, the Henshin boom. So, what is Kamen Rider? Long story short, it all starts with Shocker, an organization of former Nazis that seek to rule the world. In order to achieve that goal, Shocker has been kidnapping people and turning them into an army of cyborg super soldiers. Takashi Hongo, a big-brain motorcyclist and college student, is kidnapped and turned into a Shocker cyborg. However, before the villains were able to reprogram him, Takashi escapes, and as the Kamen Rider, dedicates his life to stopping the evils of Shocker. Going to get this out of the way now. Kamen Rider isn't the place to look for the art of fine storytelling. The writing is rife with cliches, head-scratchers, contrivances, and repetition. Then there are the issues beyond the text. In addition to never exactly being state-of-the-art to begin with, Kamen Rider shows its age. There's a reason why a lot of it is set in the Japanese countryside, industrial locations, or recycled Shocker sets. The Shocker monsters, in both design and execution, can be an acquired taste. Their costumes often appear to be purchased from a budget Halloween store, and the monsters love spamming over-the-top laughs like a brief glance might be enough to put off the average uninitiated viewer. Heck, it's probably enough to turn off even some Tokusatsu enthusiasts. But not giving it a proper chance would be a tragic mistake because Kamen Rider defies standard judgment. If you manage to get past what can be a rough initial episode or two, you might just find yourself hooked. So what's to like? There are a couple of major factors at play here. First, there's Kamen Rider himself, the motorcycle-riding, grasshopper-themed, wind-powered superhero. Kamen Rider popularized the term Henshin, the idea of characters shouting special words or phrases to transform, and the more complex transformation sequences that other superheroes and magical girls have relied on in the many years since. His theme song is a spaghetti western inspired banger, sung by the man behind the mask, and yes, the lead actor performed his own stunts, at least at first. Anyway, watching this guy shouting his attacks as he takes down an endless supply of minions and cyborgs in an absurd fashion has more mileage than one might initially imagine. Did I say absurd fashion? Well, that's where the fun really begins.
トラの宝これに違いない仮面ライダー
Kamen Rider had less of a budget at its disposal than cinematic tokusatsu or even television tokusatsu like the Ultra series, necessitating the reliance on creative ways to make up for the lack of usual spectacle the genre normally offers. That's likely why the show leans so hard on its idiosyncratic composition and editing, from reverse footage and jump cuts to eccentric camera angles, slow motion, and shaky cam. A lot is used to spice up what could have been a boilerplate affair. Here's an example of reverse footage. Obviously the actor was hanging on to the tree and the footage was reversed to suggest he jumped up to grab the tree branch. Next, in this scene, reversing footage results in the amusing sight of the villains rolling uphill. And finally, one of my favorite examples of creative editing is found in the first episode, when Kamen Rider is surrounded by the Shocker henchmen. The sped up footage and rapid jump cutting creates a genuinely cool yet trippy effect. If you can't tell by now, the action is highly exaggerated. When villains die, they either dissolve or disintegrate into foam, hit the ground as splats of blood, unravel as beads, or when the show is feeling really ambitious, explode. Equally interesting are the special effects reaction shots. Sometimes this footage is reused a few times in the same episode. Heck, the same fight. By the way, this show loves jumping. Characters leap in the air, double and sometimes triple jumping like they're in Super Smash Bros. At times, kicks and punches don't even connect, yet villains go hurling over cliffs. There are a lot of dangerous looking stunts, and one stunt gone wrong would drastically alter the course of the show, but more on that later. The icing on the cake would be the sound effects which punctuate the fight scenes, like the cartoony noises for the jumps and the landings, or the twisted cackles and giggles of the villains. Then there's Kamen Rider's penchant for calling out his attacks. Most famous of all, finally, there's the piercing stinger, normally reserved for when Kamen Rider strikes his dab-like poses or makes his sudden dramatic appearances. It would be no exaggeration to say that the sound design and music accounts for a lot of the personality to be found in this show. Not to be ignored is the time spent on the unnerving side of things. Plenty of moody music and low lighting, horror film villain-like treatment of the shocker monsters, who at times can be legitimately threatening, and whatever these ladies are supposed to be. Plus, at one point in time, Kamen Rider himself was likely a lot more intimidating than he appears today. Imagine seeing this outside of your window at night. Another point Kamen Rider has in its favor is the likable cast at the center of everything. As of episode 13, development and dimensions are limited, but the charisma and chemistry does plenty of heavy lifting, namely that of its two most prominent characters, Takashi Hongo and Tobei Tachibana. Hiroshi Fujioka as Takashi Hongo is a fine choice for lead character, and is believable as a kind-hearted soul fighting to prevent others from meeting the terrible fate he and the other shocker cyborgs have met. Takashi's post-conversion life is treated as a troubled, alienating existence, and while the show hasn't explored it much yet, it is an interesting wrinkle. Unlike the usual superhero, Takashi keeps his condition hidden due to his conflicted feelings about it, rather than a desire to keep his loved ones safe. But that's not because he's selfish, it's just that his enemies seem to already know everything about him and his allies, as can be seen here.
驚くことはあるまい。お前が待ちかねていたショッカーが来たのだ。私がショッカーなどと。わしはただ。本郷武史の協力者、ショッカーの敵立花藤兵衛、そして緑川瑠璃子。
Wait a minute, is that Akiji Kobayashi? Why, yes it is. If his grin looks familiar, it's because you've probably seen him in the classic Ultraman shows, the early 90s Godzilla films, and one of the late 90s Gamera films. In Kamen Rider, he plays Tobei Tachibana, providing a warm presence as Takashi's mentor and most trusted ally. In addition to being the owner of Snack Amigo, the cafe that serves as the central hub of the heroes, Kobayashi has a solid rapport with the lead and is arguably the heart of the cast. The other characters are fine, but these two are the highlights and make a great duo. Remember how a stunt altered the course of the series and how the lead actor performed his own stunts? That infamous stunt involved Hiroshi Fujioka fracturing his left leg in a motorcycle accident and needing to take time off to recover. In a 2021 interview with Anime News Network for the 50th anniversary of Kamen Rider, Fujioka went into detail about the accident, saying, "At the time, I decided I would do anything to return to the show, so I spent a lot of time going through rehabilitation for my body, and that was a big ordeal for me. Even looking back now, it's a fight I would never want to have to face again. Regardless of that, I got a lot of courage from the children, and so I wanted to give some of that back to them. That's what really motivated me. Children are the treasures of the future, so I really wanted to see their smiling faces. Even back then, they had already left a major impression on me. I think that as human beings, when you're doing something for yourself alone, you're not much, but when you are doing something for someone else, that brings a lot of extra power and capability to the human body." But until Fujioka recovered, something had to be done. The initial solution was a combination of stock footage, stand-in actors, and giving the other characters more of a spotlight. Tactics which carried the show for a few episodes, but of course, that could only be a temporary measure. Some serious retooling was in order. Ultimately, Takashi was sent to battle Shocker overseas, and, in his place, another Kamen Rider was introduced to protect Japan. Since Kamen Rider is an excessively long affair, totaling 98 episodes, and changes radically over the course of its run, the end of the initial Takashi-centric start of the show makes for a good stopping point for now. The second phase of the show and beyond can be discussed another time. But as far as the 13 episodes covered here are concerned, Kamen Rider has been a wild ride. A lot of fun, and a fascinating exercise in doing as much as possible with very little. Not everything is a home run, though there's way too much good to dismiss. The edgy Saturday morning cartoon logic the show normally operates on is enough for the show to function, and what it lacks in budget or nuanced writing, it makes up for with style, personality, and entertainment value. Give it the old 3-episode anime rule of thumb to get on its wavelength, and you might find yourself pleasantly surprised with the show. Kamen Rider is highly recommended.